Welcome to the space. It's fantastic to see such a great crowd gathered here. We're bursting at the seams, and actually so we should be, because this is a tremendous event and it's a great privilege to be able to hold it in the run-up to next week's general election. Surely there is no more critical issue at the present time than the climate crisis and how we are going to tackle it going forward. My name is Alastair Singleton, and I'm a member of the local branch of MP Watch North East Somerset and Hanham. And I'd like first to hand you over to Jessica Townsend, who's co-founder and campaign lead for the national campaign. Jess.
Thank you. I'll try and keep it very brief, but MP Watch's remit is to kind of do what it says on the tin, to be a kind of watchdog for MPs. We've had a couple of citizens, Alistair, I'm having a blank on the name. What did we have? No, not citizens' assemblies. We did focus groups. We did a couple of focus groups. One in North East Somerset and one in Wickham. And we found that both the Conservative folks here that we interviewed and the people near food poverty in Wickham all felt that their MP wasn't accountable, that they didn't have the sort of relationship where they could give feedback and express their opinions, and they certainly didn't feel that their net zero interests were being served by their MP. I've gone off. Okay, for some reason the mic went off. One of the things is kind of a dramatic question, but one of the things we do in other events that we do is we will say, do you feel that you would put the lives of your children and your grandchildren in your MP's hands? Because at this time, with net zero and the things that we face, there's a possibility that we're doing that. And if that is the case, surely we should be engaging with our politicians in order to get them to serve what we think needs to be done at this moment and to address the net zero question. And there are three ways that we relate to MPs. One is that we try and find climate allies. We're at the moment, very excitingly, in a constituency in London, a group of ours is talking to a Labour candidate now, since the election's been called, but was the MP, who is going to be a minister, and they are managed to have conversations and begin an alliance with her. Unfortunately, those things are a little bit delicate, so we can't be broadcasting and bragging over social media about that, but we feel that that's a very positive, constructive thing that's going on. For most MPs, they're not quite informed enough about the climate situation, we found, and maybe Lord Deben and Alastair will be going into why that might be. And for those MPs, irrespective of party, I should have said we're non-politically partisan. It's a little bit hard with reform because they are mostly climate deniers. But if whoever you are, if you will go for net zero and be honest about the situation we're in, then we will have a relationship with you and try to work with you. And so the second relationship is as a critical friend, where we try to be friendly and we say all the good things that are being done, but if there are negatives, we also say, why did you vote for the offshore petroleum licensing bill? And we also let constituents know how their MP is voting. And our third sort of relationship, which is with a much smaller group, but rather a critical one, is that if someone's a climate denier, we don't think they should be in Parliament. We think we need people who will represent our interests. So that's MP Watch. I'm really thrilled to be here. The group here is fantastic. Please join them if you haven't been involved before. And I'll hand back over to Alastair to take things from here.
And I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge warmly our co-hosts this evening, who are Keynsham Community Energy, which is a local community benefit society driving to create renewable, green, community-owned energy schemes across Keynsham and area, as well as advising families, businesses and others on energy efficiency and how to lower their energy bills, particularly at this time of cost of living crisis. And we've got two of the directors here tonight, Matt and Tom, and I'm absolutely sure that at the end of the evening they'd love to talk to anyone who would like to learn more and sign up to become better informed about their activities. So this evening our subject is net zero, and our guest of honour is Lord Deben, he's been a fixture of our politics for over 50 years now, having first been elected as a Conservative MP way back in 1970 when I was too young to vote. Thank you. He served as Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food from 1989 to 1993, and then was appointed by John Major to his cabinet as Secretary of State for the Environment from 1993 to 1997. And during that time he introduced the Environment Act of 1995. BBC Wildlife magazine named him as one of its top 10 environmental heroes and described him as the Environment Secretary against which all others are judged. Friends of the Earth, no less, also described him as the best Environment Secretary we've ever had. Lord Deben was appointed Chair of the Climate Change Committee in 2012 and served in that capacity until last year when he stepped down. The Climate Change Committee, as you will know, is an independent statutory body whose role is to advise the UK and devolved governments on their emissions targets and report to Parliament on progress to control greenhouse gases and preparing for an adaptation to the impacts of climate change. If there was ever a body with a remit to speak truth to power, this is surely it. And if you are ever looking for a leader with the experience, the knowledge, the profile, and inclination to head it, I suggest you would look no further than the gentleman on my right. Lord Deben, welcome to Keynsham.
Thank you.
And I would like to start by apologising that GWR did its usual effort of welcoming you to the West Country, hence our slightly later than planned start this evening. Could I start by sort of taking you back to the early days when you first became engaged with the climate change issue, when it first struck you that there was a problem there, and when you realised that global heating was happening?
Well, it was rather early on. I mean, I was the Deputy Minister of Agriculture and I was responsible for sea defences. I had been reading the science, not particularly because of that, but because I was keeping up to date with it. And it seemed to me perfectly clear that global warming, as we called it in those days, was happening. It also seemed to me very logical that if the way in which the Earth had got cool enough for life as we know it was because trees and bushes had grown and had taken carbon out of the atmosphere, if you then burnt those trees and bushes and their fossilised coal and oil and threw it back into the atmosphere, it seemed to me that it was likely to have the opposite effect. It was a very simple and probably very unscientific concept, but if you went one way it does this and the other way it seems to me to have done that. And the second thing that really affected me, apart from the fundamental science, which is where I started, was that it did seem that we spent millions and millions on centuries of astronomy, but we never actually found another planet which could maintain life as ours does. Now, there may be one, but we haven't found one so far, which suggests that there is a delicate balance here which doesn't happen anywhere else. So one ought to be a bit careful about it. That was seemed to me to be a pretty obvious thing. And the third thing, and again, a very, very simple thing, and that is, I began to be rather angry at having to prove that putting alien gases into the atmosphere meant that I had to prove that it wasn't safe. It seemed to me it ought to be the other way round, that if you do something which is extraordinary, and that is what we have done over the past 250 years, if you do something that is extraordinary, you have to prove that it's safe, not ask others to prove that it's unsafe. And so those three things, which were very sort of domestic, simple concepts, really led me to accept the science. And of course, by that time, the science was becoming pretty strong, but not as strong as one would say it was today. And then we had a meeting about sea defences, and we all sat round, and I learnt from the man whom I think was in many ways the best minister, choir minister that we've had for a very long time, which is Michael Heseltine. He gave me he's a great friend, and he gave me a bit of lesson. He said, well, when you first go, the first thing you must do is to get all the civil servants who've worked on a particular concept and get them all in, not just accept the document, but actually discuss it with them, because you'll discover that the document is very often a balance between people, and you want actually to hear what the disagreements were. Now, Michael has to do that because he is very strongly dyslexic. So he couldn't read all this stuff, but he could get them all round and get them to talk to him about it. So I, who am not dyslexic, did do this. And a very smooth, I've always remembered it, a very smooth civil servant said, well, now, Minister, we've done our usual look here, and every 10 years we do this about sea defences, and I'm happy to tell you that we don't believe that there needs to be any change in the standards of sea defences that we have. So I said, well, that's very interesting, and I've read the document and the rest of it, but does everybody agree with this? So looking round, there was a young man, I do wish I knew who it was, at the back, who said, well, that of course isn't true if you believe in global warming, because in that case we ought to raise the sea defences by 10 centimetres or so. So I said, well, I do believe in global warming. And at that, the senior man said, oh, you're very brave, Minister. So I knew we were in trouble. And he said, but, you know, the Treasury will never accept this. See? So I said, well, I was writing Mrs. Thatcher's speeches at the time, so I said to her, you know, this is really quite serious. And she said to me, well, John, she said, there are two people in this government who believe in climate change, global warming. She said, one is you and the other is me. We are therefore a majority, so go ahead. And that's why we do have a better protection than others. But it was the science. It was genuinely the science. I'm not a scientist, and therefore I do look at these things rather carefully, and I ask the most simplistic of questions. I found that actually rather useful, not being a scientist, because if you ask very simple questions, you very often find that people don't have very simple answers, and that's very important. You can get some really important bases for that, and very helpful when I had to deal with BSE, because they're detailed understanding of that. So they had to explain it to me, and then I could explain it to other people, which is really a great advantage if you don't really understand the science. So having looked at the science and then thought about it in the context of what I call domesticity, I was absolutely convinced and have been ever since.
Interesting. And of course, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, that at that time when you were a minister, she made her famous speech at the United Nations General Assembly, yes, at which she laid out the science. did you write that speech, or did you help write that speech? Did you have input to that speech?
Well, one of the joys of life is to quote Mrs. Thatcher, knowing that you wrote that sentence. I have to tell you there are certain advantages. No, well, I can't remember that. I mean, we contributed to so many of those speeches. And the phrase, I think, was the one which she liked most and which we worked on together, was saying very simply, we don't have this world freehold, but on a full repairing lease. And I think that's something, she was very good at understanding. You talked about things in a way which people understand them, and people know the difference between freehold and a full repairing lease is. And that is the difference between those who think that you can treat this world as if you owned it outright and you could do anything you like with it, and those of us who believe that we are very fortunate to have been given this world and we have a duty of stewardship. And of course, I happen to hold that religiously, but I also hold, I think that and that's why one of the reasons why I think the best statement about all these issues is that which the Pope made in Laudato Si, because what he said was that climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. That's the symptom of how we have mistreated the land, polluted the seas, polluted the air, treated other people, the modern slavery, all those things. There isn't a division between them. They're all part of what we have done wrong. And that is what is being shown by climate change, which is the earth crying out for healing. And it seems to me that understanding is for me absolutely central to it. And I've got an atheist friend who's a great scientist. He said to me, I may be an atheist, he said, but if you really want to understand climate change, read that, Laudato Si, because it is actually the shortest, quickest and most fundamentally clear view about what it is that with which we're faced.
Excellent. I mean, we do get appalling headlines. I mean, just this week we've had 1,300 odd pilgrims on the Hajj in Saudi Arabia dying from heat stroke. The news appears to get worse and worse. What recent climate indicators are causing you particular concern at the present time?
Well, the fundamental issue is that the poorest always are affected most in every society. And when you looked at the terrible damage of heat in India, and you think of the conditions in which the people concerned are living anyway, and then you see what very extreme heat in India and indeed throughout Asia. And then you look at what's happening in the poorest parts of southern Europe too, where heat has been the great... And then you can go to, I suppose the thing that affected me most because it was very local. My local village was flooded for the first time. And we have farmers in the east of England who neither were able to harvest because it was too wet, nor have they been able to plant for the next year. So they, very often pretty hard pressed anyway, have 2 years without any income. Now that in a rich country is pretty awful, but when you see what's happened in the poor countries, and when you listen to the Saudi Arabians explaining why these people have died, and what they've really said is, well, they're all poor people who couldn't have gone on the Hajj otherwise, and they've all done it illegally because they can't afford the £2,000 or whatever it is to have that. I mean, you really do begin to understand just how careless people are about the poorest in the world. And that's one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about fighting climate change, because the people who will be hit, all of us in this audience, all of us here, have all sorts of ways of protecting ourselves against the worst of the immediate effects. We've got houses with roofs on, and we've got the ability to wear clothes which are satisfactory, and we can open the windows. All those are perfectly possible in the hot weather, and in the cold weather we are able to protect ourselves from the worst of the rain. That isn't true of very large parts of the country, of the world, and we ought to remember that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thinking about the COP process that is beginning to sort of pick up momentum now and kind of getting many more headlines, and thinking specifically about the Paris Agreement, which is perceived as being where we really made some serious progress. What observations do you have about how that is going and how we have managed to build into law some of the targets? And have we done it sufficiently? Have we been successful in doing it? How do you see it?
Well, of course we haven't been successful because we haven't done it as much as we should. But I always think you've got to think about this from two different angles. If I look back from now to the point at which I began as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, I wouldn't have imagined then that we could have done as much as we've done. Now, when I look forward, I realise just how much remains to be done, and so that makes me very much more depressed. When looking back, I am pretty pleased because I didn't believe back then that we'd get the whole world to sign up. I knew that if we did, they wouldn't all do what they promised to do. But, I mean, Paris was quite an impossibility in 2012. And then by 2015 we had it. And then who would have thought that a Conservative Prime Minister would have fought in Glasgow to get the toughest demands and targets of any country in the world. Now, I'm not sure that I could possibly say that we've lived up to those so far, but at least we started off down that route. And I think we need every now and again to remind ourselves of the one great advantage which we have, which is first of all that it was a cross-party agreement that made the Climate Change Act. It was the Climate Change Act was written by the Conservative Party and Friends of the Earth, and we then sold it to the rest of the opposition because we were in opposition. Then we said to the Labour Party, who was in government, we said we don't want this to be a party political thing. So you've got to take it on as an act. And what's more, we've got 100 Labour members of Parliament going to vote for it anyway, so we better get that friend. And that's what Gordon Brown did. So we can genuinely say that this is an all-party basis. And the Act, of course, is absolutely crucial because it was the first time in the world in which we made it the law of the land that we had to reach a reduction in our emissions. Now, it started off, when we first wrote the Act, I have to say, it started off with 60% reduction. And then during the debates, we realised this wasn't enough. So we asked the incipient Climate Change Committee, chaired by previous chairman, to look at this and see whether that was right. And they came back and said, no, it had to be 80%. So we did it as 80%. And of course, the trouble with we never realised this, but the trouble with 80% was that a whole lot of people said, oh, well, we don't have to do it because we'll be in the 20% that doesn't have to do it, you see. So then we had, therefore, an act which said the committee will propose the targets. If Parliament votes in favour of those targets, then, of course, it becomes the law of the land and the government has got to deliver it. And that means, of course, that the courts can be brought in if the government doesn't deliver it. Now, the thing that I don't think people very often face up to is that this is an incredibly clever way of balancing the two problems. On the one hand, with climate change, you have to go on doing what you need to do. You can't start and stop and start and stop. You have to go on doing it. But democracy demands that every 4 or 5 years you renew the mandate. So how did you balance these two things? So the way we did it was to say that the Climate Change Committee would be entirely independent. It would consist almost entirely, apart from the chairman, would consist almost entirely of experts in the sense of climate scientists and economists. And that would then produce the budgets of how much we had to do each 5 years, do it well enough in advance, and then Parliament would vote on it. And once Parliament, so that was the democratic bit, but the expert bit was us producing it. And the chairman is chosen in a very interesting way, because the chairman is chosen by, well, take my own case, I was chosen by a Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition, the Scottish Nationalist First Minister of Scotland, the Welsh Socialist First Minister of Wales, and the Protestant Unionist First Minister of the North of Ireland, and they got a Conservative and a Catholic. So that was so it did make sure that one was very independent, because of course you advise not just the government, because it's a parliamentary advice. So you're advising the Labour Party, Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Welsh Nationalists, and the Ulster Unionists, and so that's all the Democratic Unionist Party. So one has to be entirely independent, which is why I've continued to be so, because you have to learn to work with whoever it is, because this is something we do together, and we must defend that, because the countries that don't have it find life very difficult. Look at the poor Australians, where a very sensible Australian government is faced by a perfectly unacceptable opposition, who would in fact reverse everything that they've done. Irrespective, don't look at the science, don't bother about any of that. I mean, it is really remarkable. You know, neither look at the science nor listen to the church. It seemed to me that if you do both, get rid of both of those, that's quite, in Australia, it seemed to me that was very peculiar. But that is what Mr. Dutton is trying to do. And in America, the battle between Democrats and Republicans, it is nonsense that you divide the parties. And then within that, of course, the danger is that you then become complacent, because you're all signed up to the same thing. And therefore, it's very important to keep people on their toes, which is why I'm a great believer in general MP watching. And that's why we've set up a website, which you can all look up on. It's very simple. It says Climate Election 2024. And what we've tried to do there is to tell you what each candidate in every constituency, you just put your postcode in, and then you can look up and see all the candidates who are standing in your, and the ones we talk about are the ones who are signed up to net zero and who have been in government since the Climate Change Act. So Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats and Welsh Nationalists. We're doing it in England and Wales. It all had to be done rather quickly, because we rather thought there might be an election rather later, and therefore getting this up has been really quite difficult. But what we tried to do is to say, look, we want candidates from all the members of Parliament, all the parties. We want them to be committed to two very simple concepts. First is that they will work to get net zero by 2050. Now, I'd love to do it earlier. I think it's pretty difficult to do it earlier, but I'm sure we can do it by 2050. And secondly, that they will continue to fight to make sure that we do by 2030 and 2035 what internationally we have committed ourselves to do. Because if you don't do that, you can't get to 2050, in net zero in 2050. And so we haven't allowed candidates to talk in general terms about their support for nature and the environment. They have to actually answer the question about the times and the dates and the percentages, because that's the only way to get these things done. And I'm very pleased to see just what a wide range that we have got, and part of people from every those four major parties are really committed. And there are some very interesting constituencies where you'll be very surprised when you looked at, if you wanted to make a choice on the question of the climate, you might not find yourself making the choice you might imagine. I've found a Labour Member of Parliament who is a climate change denier, a Tory Member of Parliament whose explanation of where he stands for, it's quite difficult to understand quite where he stands, and a Liberal Democrat who wrote and said that they couldn't answer my questions because they hadn't got the manifesto yet, so they didn't know where they stood on climate change. So, I mean, I do have to say that one learns a great deal in this thing, including one candidate who said, I've just written back to her, she said, I'm afraid I get so many questions that I can't answer any of them about my views until after the election. So, I mean, that's a fat lot of use, isn't it? So there we are. So do have a look up, and if we don't happen to have found a candidate that you know about, will you tell us about them? Though we'd like to know that. We always, having written it, we then send it to the candidate, and they have a couple of days to say whether that's true or not, so that you be absolutely fair to people. And it's run Trust Party, 4 of us from the House of Lords, Helena Kennedy from the Labour Party and Robin Teverson from the Liberal Democrats and Dafydd Wigley from the Welsh Nationalists. And so all of us keep an eye on making sure this is absolutely fair. And we do try to be utterly fair on it. And it does mean that people can then do 2 things. One is they can see what their candidate, rather than the party, thinks about these things. And the second thing is, after the election, we will have commitments from everybody who is elected, because we will have covered everybody by then. And then you lot have got to make sure that people stick to that. And it's at this point I do my naughty thing, which is to say, how many people here have actually been to see their Member of Parliament over the last 6 months and talked about climate change? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, I'll come back to waste of time, innit? 7. So there are 7. Now that means you're at the top end of every meeting I do. Now, as you all have been interested because you've come to this meeting, so you probably feel strongly about it. Now when people say it's a waste of time, now that's absolutely wrong. Now let me explain why. First of all, if democracy is to work, members of Parliament have to know what their constituents think. I keep on meeting members of Parliament, including probably the one you're talking about, who say to me, I never have it on the doorstep. And now, can I just say, you can make all that noise, but I'm telling you what people say, and I'm not making any comments about any particular member of Parliament, because I've heard it from all 4 political parties. And I know that's true because I have gone canvassing and I have found that people don't raise it on the doorstep. You have got to raise it with them all the time. If a Member of Parliament discovers that this is really something that matters in his constituencies or her constituency, it's the only time you can really influence them, because the people they are interested in are the people who have a vote. And if you say it doesn't actually count, well, sometimes it doesn't. And I can think of some pretty difficult members of Parliament of all political parties. I've worked with them all, and some very good, easy people of all political parties. But most members of Parliament of all political parties are there because they want to make the world a better place. And I'm fed up with people who attack politicians. That's absolutely true, right across the board, irrespective of party, except possibly Reform. But the place they want to make the world is not better, and therefore I'm not. But the point is, leaving that aside, and I think they are actually out with the general political view, but leaving that aside, people are in Parliament in order to do this, and really they do listen. But if you never talk to them, they find it extremely difficult. There's a gentleman shaking his hands there. I just have.
Respond?
Yes, well, you can respond if you want. Yes,
I've been to see Jacob Rees-Mogg twice in the last 4 years and spent half an hour talking to him about climate change. And it's quite clear to me he's complete denial, and it won't make any difference talking to him. But I completely agree it's really important to speak to our MPs.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to make any comments on any individual person, but I merely say to you that even if the person concerned is continuously in denial, if everybody here had gone to that Member of Parliament, you do begin to think that one's got to think about it a bit more. I just think you've got to keep the pressure up right across the board. I can think of a whole series of members of Parliament, all political parties, who really do need to keep their feet to the fire. Now, if there is a change of government, let me tell you, an incoming government's going to have just the same problems as any other government. When the Labour Party rightly decided that it was not going to allow any more expansion of gas and oil in the North Sea, who were the first 2 people who opposed it? The GMB and Unite trades unions, the 2 biggest paymasters of the Labour Party. So let's face it, what we're trying to get politicians to do is tough. And the first thing we've got to do is to make sure they know that we're here and we care about it. I'm sure you were very good, the 2 goes of your part, but I'd like all sorts of other people to do it. And not just to him, but to everybody in the country. And I have to say, as a Member of Parliament myself for many years, I can number on the fingers of one hand how many people ever came to me to talk about climate change. And yet they all come to talk about animals, and they all come to talk about farming, and they all come to talk about all sorts of other things, but they don't come on climate change. Now, there's a very good way of helping those who are a bit frightened about talking about the big thing, and that is that Friends of the Earth have got a very good website where you can look up and see what are the issues of climate change in your constituency. So if you just go along and say to the Member of Parliament, what are you doing about this, which is flooding or particular problems of old people's homes that aren't properly protected, all those things. You really do have a wonderful opportunity of raising that, because then you've got 2 things. You've got a voter and you've got something in that Members of Parliament's constituency. And you're going to have to do that whatever the results of the election are, because we've got to give the Members of Parliament the confidence that they can stand up against all the arguments that will be put to them, which are always about, oh, I quite agree about net zero. We do have to do it, but not quite yet. This is not really quite the moment. Or I'm in favour of all these things except this, which affects me, which is another. Great. And now you can help them so much if they feel, well, if I go down that road, I'll have 24 people in my surgery having a real go at me. I better just think a bit before I actually do it.
Actually, do you mind if I say something? Because I've been remiss, because I haven't done what I agreed, and I've just realised that I didn't do that. So at the beginning with the introduction, I was going to kind of outline the framing of the evening, and because I haven't done that, then I feel remiss. So we have invited Lord Deben here. As you can tell, he's a very experienced and robust speaker and politician, but he's here as in a non-partisan way. Although this is an election period, so it's very hard for any of us not to have that in our consciousnesses, we're not here to be party political. In fact, all of the candidates were invited here. I think there may be one in the House, but so that everybody is able to come and talk about net zero, because our opportunity at this election is to do what Lord Deben just outlined, and to remind all of the candidates, and then they will tell their parties as well, that this is of huge importance to us. But what we don't want to do is to have any sort of party political speeches, or Labour is this, or we want to particularly if we thought lots of candidates were here, because once candidates start talking, they can't help but give their party's view, and that's not what this evening is. It's not a hustings.
I thought you were going to say can't stop.
Well, I was being polite. So forgive me, Alastair, I was remiss at the beginning, and I also didn't introduce Alastair, so that was very naughty as well. Would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
No. Okay. I fly under the radar at this one. Thank you for that, and thank you for the reply. And you mentioned how your website was taken by surprise and the dates for the election, and the headline suggests that lots of people were and some weren't quite so surprised by the dates of the election. But there we go. But I really like the approach you mentioned for the Climate Change Committee and for the work you're doing now about being cross-party. this is so important, it has to be seen in a cross-party way, and we must try, I suppose, to avoid party political point scoring and work with individuals as individuals who hopefully in many cases share our values. And I noticed that earlier this month you launched the new Council for Net Zero Transport, which again I think is being set up with a view to working with whatever government may come in after next Thursday. And would you like to say some more about that?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the history, you see that we've been very successful in decarbonisation of generating capacity. The reason that has been possible is that you do that and nobody notices, in the sense that electricity is electricity is electricity, and the fact that it comes from renewables rather than from coal or oil or gas, as far as the recipient is concerned, it doesn't notice.
Yeah.
Now, we've been struck by price rises and the rest, but that has not been connection with this. Ought to be, because of course renewables are much cheaper than any other form of generation. But the truth is that we've been able to do that without a huge amount of public involvement. The things that we now have to do involve the public in a very particular way. And transport is one of the three biggest areas which we have to deal with. Home heating is one, and agriculture is another, but transport is hugely important. And much of the change in transport can be done by technology, of course. The movement to electric vehicles is hugely important. I'm really fed up with the fact that almost every week the newspapers carry stories about how electric vehicles don't work. And I just want to remind people of who's been writing those stories. They're called large oil companies, largely American oil companies, who obviously want to try to pretend that this is so. I therefore remind you that I've got an electric car and I've had it for 3 years, and last month it had its first service. The cost of running it is enormously cheap. It's quite expensive to buy, but I don't have any difficulty with fitting it into the road in London where I live when I'm in London. There are plenty of chargers, and I have a charger at home, and we can make it very much better and very much easier. But that will happen, and I did not agree with the government's decision to put it off from 2030 to 2035. I thought that was entirely wrong, and it's entirely wrong for very simple reasons. First of all, you mustn't promise something and then change it, because that means that next time you promise something, people don't believe you're necessarily going to do it. Secondly, it discombobulates the whole market, because everybody was building towards that and perfectly able to do it. And thirdly, it doesn't help anybody, just doesn't help anybody. And to suggest that somehow or other it makes it easier, this awful phrase which I hear from all political parties, making it easier for working families. It's a sort of phrase they use, and it covers almost anything they want to do. And I'm sort of rather cynical about it, listening to, and it comes from all of them. And let's be quite clear, nobody doesn't use it in one way or another. So the fact is that we can see our way forward on the vehicles, vans and cars. But the real difficulty is, how do we make the changes for heavy goods vehicles? How do we make the changes for buses? How do we actually encourage people to walk and bicycle? How do we do all those things? Net zero transport means bringing the whole of those things together. And we're very lucky because we've got every major operator in this, in the sense of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. At one end we've got people who make electric vehicles, we've got people who are concerned with buses. We've got the whole range of people, including the fuel people. So the people who've actually got to change the fuels, all those. And we are going to work together to try to create a business answer. Because I believe governments are best served if you go to them with a solution rather than going to with a problem. And I'm particularly keen on that as a businessman. Apart from when I was a minister, I've been a businessman all my life, and I know perfectly well that governments don't run business very well. And so what business people ought to do is to make sure that they've got the answer. Government's very good at policy, but it isn't very good at delivery. That is truth right across the board. So if business people realise that we've got to get to net zero, what's the best way of doing that in my business, which I know about? What's the best way of doing that in this part of business that we know about? Government should be policing it, government should be overseeing it and all the rest of it, and I'm a great believer in good regulation and not in any way antagonistic to that. But I still think that business has a huge opportunity here to get the benefits out of net zero, because net zero will mean that we can do things cheaper, better, cleaner, greener. And there are lots of business opportunities, lots of new jobs, lots of abilities to export, all those things. We just have to look at this on a much happier side. I sometimes fall out with Greenpeace, who I think are a bit puritanical. And they're a bit feeling that we ought to be a bit colder and not travel as much. I think the answer is we can make a better world. What we're asking for in net zero is to make a better world. And that's what I want to do. And I want people to feel that this is what we're trying to do together. And less misery and more cheer is actually really necessary. It's going to be tough. We're going to have to do an awful lot. And above all, we're going to have to help those people who are most affected by it and who are least able to protect themselves. Of course that's true, but you don't make people do the right thing by making them miserable, in my view.
Thank you. I mean, that's a pleasingly optimistic standpoint, I think. And of course, we're at this very important, very interesting inflection point in our politics. Who knows what will happen next Thursday, but we may well find a very different government in place after Thursday. Looking forward now, what are your concerns as what may go on in the next few years? We hear a lot about whether there's going to be any money to do any of this, etc., and how we raise it. And the questions are bringing it down to all of us in this room. What do we need to be doing so that we can help the process, and not just by being pain in the neck, but hopefully by being sort of positive and creative as well?
Well, I hope I haven't encouraged you to be pains in the neck. First of all, the cost. And I think before we talk about the cost of doing it, we have to start by the cost of not doing it. If we don't do it, the cost is utterly enormous. You can't run the National Health Service if we haven't really sought to do something about climate change. You can't think about people's, not only their health, but their jobs, and the whole way in which we live is going to be undermined by that. Not least, getting the food that we need is going to be a real issue. So let's kid ourselves. This isn't a comparison between what we have to spend now and what we have to spend for the transition. This is a comparison between what we have to spend for the transition and the huge cost it will be if we don't make that transition. Now, to make the transition, we have to do two things. One is we have to do it ourselves, and nobody else will do it unless we do it ourselves. You don't do things yourself, but merely tell other people. You won't get anybody to do it at all, so you've got to do it yourself. And the second thing we've got to do is to bring other people in behind us throughout the world. Of course it's true, it's a global issue, and we have to do it all together. So, the cost, well, it's less than 1% of our gross national product. It's perfectly possible to do. The problem is that the cost of it doesn't fall equally or fairly among people. So what you have to do is to make sure that those costs are more fairly shared by a government doing a whole range of things. So if you look at the manifestos of all four major political parties, counting Plaid Cymru, if you look at that, you'll see they've all got policies for helping people to move to less damaging ways of heating their homes. Now, you can disagree with one and think the other's got a better one or not, but they've all got those policies because they recognise that we have to do. Now, you can't do that without helping the poorest by providing grants and changes of that sort, by helping ordinary moderate people who are able to pay it out of the savings they make in the fact that they're not spending so much money on their energy, but can't put the money up to start with. So there's a great deal of money in the private sector which would lend to people if the government made a number of changes which enable that to work. For example, enabling the cost of that to go on to the mortgage of the house as an addition, because obviously if I decide to do this to my house and then I move, I've got to pass that on to whoever I sell the house. You could do an awful lot with using the stamp duty. I've always believed that one of the things we could do would be to say that when you sell a house, you must show that you have improved its energy efficiency by one class. So you've taken, let's say, D up to C. And if you haven't, then I don't see why there shouldn't be a mixture of the tax and what you get for the house, which makes sure that the next person is able to do that immediately. You can do an awful lot of changes of that kind, and that's what we have to look at. The delivery is what is going to be important, and so we can do that without saying that there's a huge amount of money to come. There's a great deal of money in the private sector that is available if we provide the mechanisms whereby that can happen. And I'm looking for a much better delivery offering than ones that we've had up to now. And if I'm honest, I think that the election manifestos of all those political parties are lacking in detail. They're all full of generalities, and we haven't seen the details which are very necessary. And that is a non-party comment because it affects every single one of the parties. Now, if you do those things and you begin to understand that people need help and they need help in different ways, you can move the whole of the society in the right direction. But you can only do that if you look at everything through the lens of climate change. If you make decisions right across the board. And I'll give you a single example. The Treasury has really got to change a number of its rules in order to enable you to do some very simple things. In France, school playgrounds, school car parks have got covers, and they get them for nothing because companies come and put the cover over, which with our hotter weather is going to be very necessary, and they put on the top of the cover, of course, photovoltaic cells. And they then provide electricity for the school, and they pay for, so the school gets cheaper electricity, the company gets the opportunity to generate electricity and sells it into the grid. That's something we could do here, but you know we can't do it because we've got Treasury rules which have been supported by all political parties. Treasury rules that don't accept that. It took me a very long time to get the Treasury rules changed about the simple matter of LED lighting for public lighting. You couldn't do a deal where somebody put the LED lighting and then was paid for it by the saving in the electricity. We just make it things more difficult, and so there are many things that we can do which don't cost any more. I'll give you a tiny little thing. The law says that National Grid is not allowed to use batteries. There are all sorts of historic reasons why. Now, when you are reformulating the grid, which you have to do, there are many places where you don't need to reinforce the grid, but you need to have some means of additional energy for very short periods of time at particular peak moments. The cheapest and most sensible way to do that is to install a big battery. And those big batteries are, of course, charged by the wind or the sun when you've got too much of it. As you know, sometimes you've got too much wind power and too much wind electricity, you can't use it. So they have to pay for it, even though they can't use it. Well, if you use that to charge the batteries, of course, you actually get energy not just for nothing, you get it for less than nothing because you don't have to pay. Now, that's a change in the law which you could make tomorrow afternoon. You know, and there are a whole series of things like that. So I don't believe this business about saying that we can't afford it. One last thing is, if you want people to change, you just have to make it certain that that change is happening, which is why I was so annoyed at the actually not terribly important changes that were made. But the fact there were changes will undermine people's confidence. Business will only invest if they know you're going to stick to that policy. And that is what we have to do. We have to show a real willingness to stick to their policies, and that will enable people to invest. And there's a great deal of money which will come to us if we set the example. Otherwise, it'll go to the rest of Europe, it will go to the United States, and it won't come to us. And we need, therefore, to give that certainty to business investment.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's actually a very good place to bring it all together, and thank you for that. I mean, it's been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I understand that you're very generously prepared to take some questions from the floor. We've got a roving mic somewhere. Roving mic over there.
Well, there's a lady there who's been trying to ask a question all the time, so she must be first.
Hi, so firstly, well, I've got two things to say. The first is a direct response to the electric vehicles myth. I'd like to address the fact that electric vehicles and the use of batteries rely on minerals, slave labour, and are not a sustainable alternative, and they aren't going to be available for all. I think it was in South Korea recently that some students developed a hydrogen-powered car, and I know, being a child of the 80s, and also being a child whose dad was offered a position at NASA when I was younger, that hydrogen engines were opposed for some time by the USA, but they would give out water as a byproduct and would require the minerals from the batteries. So I just wanted to address that as a direct response, although I appreciate there's a lot of information out there. I believe Koa Lucas once addressed this, and the fact that whilst they are touted as a great alternative to petrol, it does need some reconsideration. Sorry. Secondly, as a child in 1984, one of my early memories, apart from the tunnel being dug, was a memory of the fishing quotas that were recommended by scientists being surpassed by the government. How can we rely on governments following scientific advice? I believe that was in the early 90s when they went against the recommended fishing quotas and had decimated sea life in the oceans around our country. I appreciate that there are problems in continuity of government with the first past the post system when there could be proportional representation, but could we not also look towards something like a ministry of the future, for the future, like I believe Finland or Sweden have? Could that be a cross-party solution?
Well, with that, as the longest-serving fisheries minister, I have to tell you that without getting too complex in the fisheries, the real problem about fisheries is the constant battle between the scientists and the fishermen. And I give you an example of the Canadians who who were being lobbied, the government in Canada was being lobbied by the fishermen because they were objecting to the quotas for cod the day that the last cod was caught off the Grand Banks. There is a real issue about trying to put this right, and I am still scarred by those Brexiteers who tried to tell the fishing industry that if we left the common fisheries policy, they'd all be able to fish whatever they like. Total nonsense. Absolutely not true. And the fact is that, of course, we have been overfishing, not just here and in the Mediterranean, but far beyond those seas, and particularly, again, an example of taking from the poorest, because what we've done, having outfished our own fish stocks, we've actually now got to take other people's fish stocks because we'll pay more for it. But we could go on for a long time about fish stocks. Now, as far as electric cars are concerned, there's an old Yorkshire saying that you don't get out for nout, and there is no doubt that in order to move to where we have to do, electric cars are not perfect. They are very, very much better than any alternative that we have at the moment. The hydrogen argument is one that is extremely difficult because it's being promoted by those fossil fuel companies, because they like the idea of having something that is rather like petrol, only it's hydrogen. You know, and they will produce it. It's all to do with that. Now, the problem with hydrogen is very simple, and that is that you need that amount of hydrogen to make that amount of energy. In other words, it's an extremely difficult transference that you have to do. So you've got to carry that amount to do that. The second thing about hydrogen is that you have to make it is very, very expensive in energy. And green hydrogen is extremely expensive to do. Climate Change Committee has looked at this in very, very great detail, entirely independently. I just have to say to you that it is our view that hydrogen will be very limited in the amount that will be used. It will be used in those circumstances where it has an advantage different from anything else. For example, in the production of steel, hydrogen is important for getting rid of the impurities. There will be hydrogen hubs in certain places, particularly off the Humber, for example, because of the heavy industry there that will be able to use hydrogen. But hydrogen is not the answer. Even now, people think in heavy vehicles. They always said, you know, the very heavy vehicles would have hydrogen. It's an extremely difficult thing to handle, and batteries are becoming three things: better, smaller, and using fewer and fewer of the rare minerals that were had before. Now, if you then move on to your comment about slave labour, almost everything that we have is capable and has been produced by slave labour. I spend a lot of my time working on what we call modern slavery and trying to eradicate it. There are certain companies producing clothes who are not careful about where they get those clothes made and how people do it. But there is no doubt that in the mining industry, of all mining industry, there is a good deal more proportionately of this than you have elsewhere. But that's true of everything that you have which is mined. It is the mining industry has in fact a very poor history of this. It's improving considerably. We can improve it a great deal more. But I just say to you that what you've said about electric cars, I know where all that comes from. That comes from people who don't want electric cars, not because they want something better. It's because they want to stick with what we've got. So every time you can find a reason, this is what they do on range. What the fear of range,
anxiety.
Range, and the fact is, most modern electric cars have a very good range indeed. But I just warn you, be careful about where this information comes. I've looked at it through the Climate Change Committee with the very best people. We've looked at it extremely carefully. I have no doubt at all that in a very short period of time we will have batteries which will be smaller, more powerful, and will not be using the things that you most concern about. So let's get on with that as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Steve.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much. You'll be aware, because I know you've written about it, about our local airports expanding by 2 million passengers a year. This is actually trashing local democracy, because all the elected representatives and 82% of people were against the plans. You'll also know, I think, that 20 other airports have got, are trying to expand, 100,000 planes in Gatwick and so on. My question is really, do you think we can ever meet our legal targets if the aviation industry is just allowed to expand exponentially? And please don't say sustainable aviation fuels are the answer, because they're just not.
The answer is no. I mean, I agree with you entirely. The answer is no. And that's why the Climate Change Committee said very clearly we had to have a clear national box, so to speak, of what we would allow, and that you couldn't do what we're doing at the moment, which is allowing one expansion there and another expansion there. That's the first thing. Second thing, we have to stop a lot of the changes which are happening, which are being done on the basis that we're not going to make the changes which we have to make in the aviation industry. For example, ExxonMobil is building a pipeline from Fawley near Southampton. It's taking that to Heathrow, and it's 147% bigger than the one it's got at the moment. Now, the basis for that is that it believes that we're going to expand the amount of fossil fuel use in aviation. That's wholly contrary to what the government has said and what the opposition has said, but that it's decided to. No one here, no one who is an environmentalist should ever buy anything from ExxonMobil. It's the worst company in the world. It has done more damage than any other single company, so don't ever buy anything from it at all. Esso is a company which should not be thought of. But that's an example of the industry behaving. And they're committed to net zero, you know, in 2050. But of course they know that no director of ExxonMobil will be alive then. They'll have died. So they'll have made their money and that will be it. So always think about, I think as far as the aviation industry is concerned, we have to be very clear. There is really no space for expansion of airports except in certain very specific areas. For example, there is one airport where at the moment, because of the configuration, they have they have to move the airplanes under their own power. And you need certain changes so that it would be possible, therefore, to use electric vehicles pulling them back. You could reduce the emissions just by... So you have to look at it through the same lenses, the lens of climate change, when you make those decisions. But in general, the expansion of air transport is just not possible. What we have to do is to have less and less of the emissions from the aviation fuel. The industry is doing a great deal to replace it. There are very many examples of what they're doing. We've got to encourage that, and we've got to help them to do that by saying we're not going to allow you to expand in other ways. If you put the box round it, then you start to make people have to find alternatives if they're going to provide the services that they want to provide. And that seems to be very clear. And we have been very strict about that in the Climate Change Committee, and I continue to be so. And that's why I was entirely opposed to the extensions of Heathrow, not least because they were asking for the extension of Heathrow without telling anyone that if you did that, because of the climate change arrangements, it would mean stopping any other expansions anywhere else, even if they were necessary.
I would like to speak about education, if I may, because that's very important. Thank you.
The COP project is a very worldwide ambition, but we need to train the young minds. Now, as a teacher, probably the 80s and the 90s, we had on the language syllabus, we were teaching about plastics, green energy, and I remember in the German, Fernwärmung, distant heating, so much. We need to go back to the classroom and let them know what's going on. Those who do languages get it very well. Nottingham University, for example, last time I went there, he's actually studied hydrogen, and he's also studying the ways of creating gas to houses. We need to look at our youth and to see where they're actually getting the education in the schools and beyond, and how that is disseminating. And the second thing we need to look at is our councils, because it's a very nice green policy to plug up all the roads, but there are 2 points about that. But the first thing is, also, we need to encourage small local projects. There was here, and it has now been dismantled, a small project of an anaerobic digestion plant, and that would have carried a little vehicle around the town to collect all the waste, but Baines did not agree that they would allow the green waste to go on this anaerobic digestion project, which is why it's now built up and the town is terrorised by the idea of enormous lorries. But had the Baines encouraged the policy that was there, which was absolutely carefully and was being done in Germany and other areas of England, we need to educate our councils. This is not enough simply to have road policies. And the second thing about road policies, if you read brief, the first thing is the amount of nitrous dioxide around schools. And it's very good that you have a great deal of building in our area, but you are not having a green policy when you are removing green fields, which remove trees from the nitrogen from the air, and the carbon capture actually is being displayed as being unimportant. And it is excellent to have many houses, but if you cannot carry them. Another thing that we learned in school in the 80s and the 90s was overpopulation. And the people are not being taught about it. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I really do think that I find it all the time. If I go to schools, they have been educated enormously well, and our young people are very much the people who are pushing this in a very serious way. And particularly in primary schools, I must say, primary schools get their grandparents to help them pressurise the parents. I mean, there's a sort of very many of you here will know that happens. I think actually I do think education has been moving very fast in that direction. I myself think that it's an out-of-date view about population. The real fact of the matter is that if we were not as greedy as we are, and if we were sensible about what we produced and how we shared it, we would be able to deal with these things in a proper way. So I don't have that concern myself. Indeed, the real problem in the Western world is a fall in population. That's going to be, and the Chinese are finding this too. So it's going to be much more complicated than that. There's no simple answer down that route. I can't, of course, comment as to what a particular council has done in particular ways. What I think about councils is that there are good ones and bad ones, and one of the interesting things is that there is no connection between the good and the bad and their party politics. It's really interesting. You have really bad Tory councils and really bad Labour councils and really very peculiar Liberal Democrat councils too. And I just say, and then you have very good in each of those. If I had to choose in London what are the two best councils I would choose one Tory council and one Labour council. And if I had to choose the two worst councils in London, one would be a Tory council and the other would be a Labour council. It really is true. And if you look at the councils who've gone bust recently, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's Tory Thurrock, Labour Croydon, and Tory and previously Liberal Democrat Woking. So, I mean, I'm not sure there's any connection with politics. Party politics. What you have to do is that local councils have got to have, given some examples of bad ones, local councils need to have more powers and need to have more independence, and we have to trust them more. And until we do that, until it's a partnership between central government and local government, we will not get the things that we need, because most of the things we need to do have to be done on a local level as well as a national level. So that's crucial.
Yeah, thank you very much.
May I just, as facilitator, just ask, there are many people here and lots of you have hands up. So in order to make the best use of the time that we have, would you mind just asking one question on one particular point? And that way we can get more people involved from the audience. Thank you.
I'm sure that chap there is going to ask one question. You had your hand up. I'm sure you'll do that.
I got a point about transport and batteries. That I used to be a scientist and these days I'm an engineer, and I've been following the technology. I think lithium-ion batteries are a transition phase. There's research going on in a couple of UK universities. I believe Nottingham is one of them, where they're investigating graphene as a charge storage device, and it looks very, very promising. It would charge a hell of a lot faster than lithium-ion batteries, and it's a hell of a lot lighter, and it doesn't use any of the nasty trace elements. However, having said that, I'll come on to my question. I actually would prefer a society where we don't need to use as many cars, where public transport is so good that people don't want to use cars. And this has already happened. This has already happened in some cities in France. What do you think the UK government could do to help improve public transport?
I mean, in principle, I agree with you, and we're not disagreeing. I live in in a very rural area, and I have to say that we have done our best to improve the public transport services, but it is very difficult to provide the kind of transport which people really are prepared to see as meeting their needs in the rural areas. In the towns, one of the things that is absolutely true is that if you take the best public transport areas, like the centre of London, it is extremely good. I do not understand why anybody needs to have a car in London, because it really is very good. We were chatting in the car. I mean, I always use the Underground. I find the Underground extremely helpful. I find some of the bus stops not being the bus that goes in the direction I want it to go to. Bit more difficult with buses, but I do find the Underground extremely valuable, and it's I think the services we have are very good in London. The trouble is that is not true in many of our major cities. It's become true in Manchester. It is to some extent true in Birmingham, but not as much as I would like to see it. So there's a great deal you can do. I think the thing you have to try to do is to do it as well as you can in the places where it is obviously possible to do it, the big conurbations. Second thing is, we really do need to have a more sensible planning arrangement, because one of the reasons that public transport doesn't meet the requirements is because we've allowed the most peculiar planning to allow people, instead of building in the centres of cities, instead of creating the sort of society which the city provides, we've spread out into the suburbs, and it has been, I think, a very false attitude. Now, I know that it's very unpopular with Reform UK if you talk about the quarter-of-an-hour city, but I know exactly what that means. I do believe that communities need to be closer and tighter so that they can have all those services within a quarter of an hour. In other words, I think you start not with spending more money on subsidising buses in the countryside. What I think you start with is all the new homes that we have to build should be built in the circumstances of creating proper communities. And that means using brownfield sites. It means planning them so that the transport can be public transport and easily arranged, and planning it so that people who can walk do walk because it's easy and comfortable and sensible, and you can reach the shops and the dentist and the doctors without having to go on any sort of transport. There's a great deal that you can do, but I think the heart of it is to reform our planning system, because it's there that we have allowed this spreading out unnecessarily into distances where it's quite difficult to provide the sort of public transport which people really expect. Can't say to people, well, you just can't travel like you used to travel. People, once they have learnt that it is easy to get from one place to another, will wish to go on doing that. So the way to deal with that is to enable more and more young people, particularly, to buy houses and to rent houses in communities where you can actually provide public transport. Planning is the key to it, in my view.
Sorry, just a gentleman up here. I've got one observation and one question. The observation is on the last comment, and that is that the bus system and the transport system in Manchester has started to work incredibly well because they've taken the buses back into public ownership. The question is that you've done remarkably well in building a consensus between the main parties at the moment. There's a huge application now for proportional representation to be brought in. How will you achieve that with the influence of much smaller parties becoming much stronger under some form of PR? In Europe, we see that happening, but in Europe they're bound by the rules of the EU. Of course, we're no longer bound by that.
Well, I mean, once you tempt me into that, first of all, the worst decision that we have made for 100 years was to leave the European Union, and we shall pay for it. We and our children will pay for it in a way which is deeply, deeply sad. Secondly, I have to say that I am not in favour of proportional representation, because I do actually believe that you need to have a Member of Parliament, even if you don't like the particular Member of Parliament, who is for your area and you know who it is, and you can do, if you do what I ask you to do, actually go and deal with them. I just have to say, when I think of what happens to my friends in Holland, they say they don't really, nobody really represents them. The other reason, I'll tell you what really upsets me about proportional representation, and that is you vote for Party A, it then has a coalition because it has to, because with Party B, D, C, E, F, and then they come together and they have a policy which specifically excludes the bit that you voted for Party A. In other words, all these things are done after elections. Whereas in this country, you know, roughly speaking, what the coalition that is called the Labour Party, the coalition that is called the Conservative Party, the coalition that is called the Liberal Democrats, roughly speaking, before an election, you know where they are. You may not like where they are, but you do know where they are. And I find proportional representation really does remove from the individual voter powers. Now, we could argue this all night, but if you want to know, that's what my view of that is. But as far as public ownership is concerned, can I just say, my experience is that it depends entirely how you run either private or public ownership. And in Manchester, you want to look quite carefully about how they've done it. It's not public ownership in the traditional way which it has been thought of before. And it is true, if you live in where I live in Suffolk, I have to tell you that I wouldn't have my local railway go back into public ownership, because I do at least now have trains, and I do have trains regularly, and they do sometimes go on time. I had none of those things before. I don't think that's just fundamental. I just think we should get away from that discussion and get to the discussion of how do you provide proper services for people, whatever the label is. How do you provide proper services for people? And we aren't very good at that. I myself believe that a balance between private ownership and strict regulation. I am a believer in the division between the police and the operator. The state should have the regulation and should use it effectively to make sure that the operation works.
I think we've got time for one more question, probably. So,
I just would like to make a point about proportional representation.
Yeah.
I lived in Denmark for a long time, and what happens is all these parties get to discuss, and yes, it's a compromise, but they're all discussing it. And so what you end up with is a society that regularly is in the top 5 happiest countries in the world. That's the point about proportional representation. Thank you.
Well, all I'd say about that is that I always believe in that division between post hoc and propter hoc. I rather suggest that Denmark is like it is not because of proportional representation, but because this is one of the things about Denmark. I must say I would prefer to live in Britain, and I know Denmark very well. I know which country I'd prefer to live in, and I know quite a lot of Danes who would agree with that. So it's not to do with proportional representation. It's a different country with different views and different ways of doing things, and some of those are jolly exciting and very good, and some of them are deeply boring. I just think we ought to be perfectly willing to say that people are different, and it works for them. I don't think it will work for us. That's the only difference. And I'm very keen for 2 ladies, because we haven't had there's a lady there and a lady there, and then I know but via that lady there who's trying.
Okay. My question is about legislation and regulation, and we're very keen for both. Talk to me then about the mainstream media in this country and its coverage of the climate and ecological crises, and wider than that, the historic systemic issues that have led us to where we are now, and their role in supporting, or otherwise, as the case may be, the nation's understanding of that predicament.
Well, that starts about 5 hours of discussion, so I will just say this. The truth is that Leveson report was, of course, exactly what we needed, and the fact that we failed to do it was because of the pressure of the large newspapers. I have a very radical view about this. I don't think that anyone should be allowed to own a newspaper of circulation of more than 100,000 who didn't pay tax in Britain. That's the first thing.
Yes, I agree with that.
Very simple. And I would have the Leveson report, the second part of it, and I'd also have a very clear fact-check system which would make a newspaper actually print the results of a proper fact-check thing. And the other thing I'd do would be to make sure that nobody buys the Daily Telegraph, and that's a part of it.
It's actually not so much of a question, but more, I believe in climate change and climate warming, but I see a lot of the benefits of climate warming. It's not excessive. The world has been a lot hotter, and actually CO2 tends to follow the increase in temperatures. The world is 10% greener now, and there are lots and lots of reasons for, following on from lots of what you've said, innovation and inventions will automatically take over from the use of fossil fuels long before they run out. And certain things like medicines, which help to keep me alive, are from fossil fuels, and you're not going to do away with that quickly. And I think it's the timing and the length of time for the targets that must be realistic and achievable. And I think that a lot of them are unachievable and unrealistic. But I think it also, some of the money could be better spent in inventions that will take over and automatically, like the gentleman said, better batteries and things like that, that will work and help to actually bring about what we want, which is actually a much cleaner environment, a cleaner world, a better world to live in, which is safer, nicer. And you and I are of similar age, and we came from when it was the smogs in London and the Black Country, and you look at the changes that we've got now and how the world is much cleaner and better. And I think we need to focus on, as you say, businesses being given the incentives to invent and create.
So see, You would like Lord Deben to respond to that. There isn't a question.
No, but I will respond to it. The only reason that the batteries are being done in the way that the gentleman there said is because they know that we have targets to meet. If you put those targets off, none of these things will happen. This is why the pressures are, and they are not, the targets we have are not pulled out of the air. The fact is that if you don't have net zero by 2050, climate change will have changed the world so much that your children and grandchildren will not be able to live on it. So please don't say we just put it off a bit. Well, if you don't believe it, I just have to say the whole of science disagrees with you. And I have to say, we really... I'm sorry, one does have to be... Well, I'm very sorry. I've spent my last 30 years working on this, and I have to say to you directly, you are wrong. The scientists... No, it's no good. We may be of the same age, but sometimes I think we have to listen to those who actually have done the work. The scientists are universally of opinion, and the problem is that it's much worse than they hoped it would be. And I do beg you, what you are saying will destroy the world for your children and your grandchildren, and you are taking this from the newspapers and the organisations.
I don't read newspapers.
Well, then where you get it from, I have no idea, but it isn't the science.
Listen to qualified, experienced scientists
who
agree on global warming. What they disagree with is some of the solutions being preserved and the timescale.
I've never met a single scientist in this area who believes that the timetable that we have is too fast. I know quite a number who think we've got to do it a lot faster. But I have to say, that is the fact. I'm afraid she's going to have to be the last one, but...
So I'll make it quick. Last week, Sally Finch, who's a resident of Surrey Council, won in the Supreme Court her case to ask Surrey Council to look at the emissions, as you know, the downstream emissions from this oil well.
Yeah.
I wondered for communities like Keynsham or other communities around the UK, do you think this will have an impact on their projects, and how might residents be able to use that case to help with their projects?
Well, I hope so. We've won two great cases recently, that one, and the case against the government for not having a proper programme to reach net zero by 2050. I had to give evidence in that first one, and I'm happy to say that the evidence was taken by the court, and therefore we are now, the government, whoever comes in, is going to have to produce a proper programme to reach net zero by 2050. And the court has accepted that. The Surrey, the recent agreement, recent court judgment is a wonderful one, because neither I nor Greenpeace really believed that we could win it. But the fact that the courts are now saying absolutely clearly that you have to take into account not just the emissions that are created by doing something, but the emissions that are created by the things that you have to buy to do it, and by what happens with whatever you create. Those emissions have to be taken into account as well. Now, as we have to do that in any business today, you have to declare what we call Category 1 emissions, which are the direct emissions, Category 2 emissions, which are the immediate proximity emissions. If you take, for example, a motor car, you have to have the emissions the motor car will produce. You have to have the emissions that the metal which is used for the motor cars use, and you even have to have the emissions of the glue which sticks the seats together perfectly properly. It's the whole lot you have to have, and that is exactly what this has now said about this suggestion for an oil well. Now, I hope very much we'll now apply that to the ridiculous concept of having a new coal mine in Cumbria. Yes. And that's so I'm surprised and thrilled. And now we've got to make sure that we take the government, whatever it is, and press it to take the same decisions about every choice they make. And if I leave one message to you, it's very, very simple. I repeat that climate change is the symptom of what we have done to the world. That means that we should be thinking about every decision we make in government, in business, in our own lives, in the companies and associations which we belong to, in our golf clubs and our football clubs, and in our churches. We have to make every decision through the lens of climate change. And if we do that, then we will meet net zero by 2050, and we will avoid the disaster which will otherwise come. And we have to be both optimistic that we can do it, because we can, and pessimistic in the sense that if we don't do it, we will have destroyed the future of our children and grandchildren. We have already done our best to do that by leaving the European Union. This is an even worse area which we've absolutely got to get right.
Lord Deben,